Hi, Kelly. How are you? It's so good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Basically, what we're doing, as you already know, is a very kind of limited video series under WERC that focuses specifically on DEI and the way that DEI as an initiative overlaps with the global mobility industry. And the perspective that we're trying to bring here is, you know, if you think about it, global mobility would not exist as an industry if it wasn't for diversity and the unique manner in which the industry brings people together from different backgrounds. But as I'm sure you're aware, there has been a lot of chatter either in the media, in the news, or sometimes even in the industry that DEI efforts are almost a bit of a passing fad. And what we want to focus on in this limited video series is one, it's an effort to show that DEI is not and cannot be a passing fad. These are critical initiatives that ensure the success of businesses in every industry. But also, I think, what we want to touch on is the role that global mobility as an industry plays in furthering DEI principles because of the nature of the global mobility industry itself. And so what I want to do is I want to start by talking to you about your journey as a woman of color in the relocation industry, and then really kind of tackle questions like, what role do you feel our industry has in furthering the DEI principles? So with that, I want to start by just, asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and, how you got to the place that you're at now.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a story that most people will start with is that you kind of fall into this industry. If you're on the RMC side, obviously with immigration or tax, might be a little bit more intentional. But I was at Boston University and got pregnant and decided to come back to Colorado. And really was looking for, I was a psych major, so I thought I would be working in the psychology field. And as a single mom, it was really hard for me to get a job. I was 5 months pregnant. And so I interviewed with a real estate agent and she hired me. And I always tell this story, she's passed just recently, but we were in the interview and she says, you keep saying you need to take off in May. What's that about? And I sort of said, well, I'm 5 months pregnant. She said, oh, thank God. I just thought you had horrible fashion sense. And that was the beginning of this amazing relationship. And the reason why I talk about it so much is because as a 21-year-old, I joined this firm that was woman-led, that had every single type of diversity within it. And she believed that we could all work together and be successful, and we were. And it was my first experience really working with folks from the LGBTQI plus community, right? It was my first experience working, even though my parents are both vets, it was my first time working with vets or people who were different than the sort of, small family sort of dynamic that I had, and even going to school. And so I started to look differently at people's abilities. And from there, so I worked with folks moving into Denver, buying houses. And then at some point, I saw an ad in the paper for a company called US Relocation. And I applied 3 times, never got a call back. I lived in what would be a pretty lower class neighborhood at the time. And I'm assuming they looked at the address and they never called. And then they put in an 800 number and you had to do a Gallup interview to be considered. And I passed with flying colors. I came in, and that's how I started in mobility. My first client was their largest client, was Fidelity Investments at the time. And I had some really amazing leaders who sort of helped me learn each facet and talk to me about making sure you understand how the money works, how tax works, how every piece of this works so that you can grow in this career. And so I was pretty blessed. And throughout my career, I have made sure to take on pieces of the business I didn't know, so that when an opportunity came, like at Xerox, I was able to move into the leadership role and lead that organization.
So when you went from that first job to the second job, you said that your boss with the first position was actually, it seems like a little bit more evolved and was very intentional in terms of ensuring that her team was diverse. When you moved from there to like your second job and maybe another role after that, were you, did you encounter any sort of like a change in dynamic, or if not, were there any differences that you saw in terms of how your new team or your new company was perhaps prioritizing diversity? And if so, how did you deal with that coming from a place where you already started off a little bit more on a positive foot than many folks in similar situations?
Yeah, so moving into mobility, that whole sense of family, community, diversity disappeared, right? Mobility at the time, leadership was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male. And I will tell you my first experience actually. So I got into this organization through the Gallup interview and all of the other interviews, but they still brought me in $30,000 under where they hired other people coming in. And at the time, I was pretty young again, and I was like, whoa, we're making all this money, until I met a woman who was hired the day after me for like 60 grand. And I was considered, I mean, I was barely making 30. And so it was sort of an eye-opening thing. And when I talked to folks about, can I perhaps get a raise? I'm doing more work. I was told no. And so I think throughout what I saw throughout all of my consulting jobs, I had to be way, not just a little bit better. And I think folks will tell you this, I had to be exceptional. There was no room for me to make a mistake. And so but at the same time, I will say that through each of those moves, there was always a champion. There was someone who saw me, who helped me navigate. One of the other things I will say, actually, I was just with the Mobility Collective in DC last week. It's a group that I helped found, that I founded a couple of years ago. And we were talking about this first job because back then, in your packet, everything was done by mail, and they would send out a headshot to your transferees. And my headshot was lightened because I was too brown. So I do remember it going out. You could not tell what nationality I was. My skin was extraordinary. I mean, it looked like someone had just taken like white paint to my face. So a little bit different. And it's unfortunate, I think, that we had those kind of experiences, because when you think about what mobility is, to your point, we're moving people who look like a rainbow all over the world to different countries and all of those things. And sometimes it matters when you have somebody who understands those challenges. But back then, that was not the case.
So when I think back on when I started my career, there were certain, so for example, like the example that you gave about how your skin color on your headshot was lightened, right? While something like that didn't happen to me, I can say that there are certain like analogous experiences. But at the time, I did not realize fully what was going on. I just assumed that this was just what I had to deal with, right? I guess this is just me having to pay my dues. I guess this is just me having it a little tougher than everyone else. It wasn't until much later that I fully grasped how wrong some of those experiences were. Like, I guess I knew it was kind of wrong, but it wasn't until much later where I realized, wow, that was really bad. That was really bad. So I'm wondering if you ever had a moment like that. I have to be like, the photo skin color story is pretty bad, and I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Like, what was your moment where you look back and you say, oh my God,
Yeah, so as I think in my role, I was always the youngest, and I was usually the only Black woman or Black person, or person of color, actually, sort of as an account executive in any of the companies I worked with. And so I have buckets of those stories. But to your point,
yeah.
you don't have a voice, right? You can't say, I deserve to be treated fairly like everybody else, because back then nobody really cared that you said, it was sort of like, do you want this job or not? And so, yeah, so there are lots of those stories. I think later in my career, when Xerox decided to divest, and I thought I'd like to, stay in the mobility industry in the RMC role, every role I got offered was at a director's level, if that, right? And it's like, I mean, I'm leading a mid-market relocation management company. I think I'm better than, not better, I don't want to say better, but more qualified than being like a director at this point in my career. And that was ultimately what made me decide to start my own company. Was I just got so demoralized by those interviews, and sitting there across from these people, in many cases, who didn't have the level of experience I had, telling me that they didn't think I was really qualified to lead. And I was like, okay, all right. So I think, to your point, there are lots of those stories. And, we have them as women, we have them as people of color. Sometimes we have them because of age. And it's hard. But I think my choice was to move forward. Sometimes wrong, right? Making wrong choices, but always to just keep pushing forward and just go to the next thing if that wasn't working. So
see, that's actually something that I feel like people perhaps don't talk about as much as they should. What you're describing is what I would say is, when I hear you talk about it, it feels almost like death by 1,000 cuts, like for you to reach a point where you were demoralized and then literally like pivot your career and head in a different direction, right? At that point, it becomes about you and your new business and the success that you've achieved as a result, right? But that's a real experience. Like that was a real thing that you went through that led you to that point when you were, you were already kind of set in your career at a pretty well-known company, And I'm wondering if, like I said, in at the time that you were going through these things, society had not fully given us all of the vocabulary words that we need to articulate what we're experiencing and what we're feeling, right? It's relatively recently that we were able to identify something as a microaggression or unconscious bias, like that sort of a thing. You didn't even have the words to explain. It was just that, kind of constant thing. So I'm wondering, like, how did you describe it? How did you kind of deal with it? I understand that you made a change in your career, but how did you even articulate like, oh, this is what's happening to me and this is what I'm feeling?
I think so. Different times, right? I was born in the end of this in the 60s, late 60s. So I grew up through like schools getting bused. Like second grade, I got bused to my first school and things like that. So I was pretty used to having people call me not nice names or not want to play with me or let me touch their things because my color might rub off, and really horrible things back then. And so I just assumed it was like that, right? I didn't. So, there was a time when I was at Xerox when my boss wanted me to move up to the director of global operations. And I remember that a bunch of folks got together and said they wouldn't report to me. Now I would call that, right? In some ways, it was sort of not like in my face, right? They met with him quietly, but it clearly was like some sort of microaggression that sort of, it impacted me. And so you start to think, well, am I the right person? You really start to doubt your abilities. And that's, I'm really lucky. I have a really strong family and some really great people who I know and love who have always come and been like, no, you've got this, right? Having your squad or your crew or whatever you want to call them to be able to lift you up when you're in those places of, am I really not good enough? If I talk a certain way that a white male would talk, or even maybe a black male would talk, right? We're angry, we're mean, we're all sorts of things, but sometimes we're just demanding respect, right? If I raise my voice, it doesn't mean that I'm like this horrible person. It just means that I've gotten to a place of frustration. You're not hearing me, and maybe I raised my voice, but we're not allowed that as women, right? We're not. And so, yeah, I think there are lots of words and I think there are lots of experiences. And ultimately, for me, it's always been about leaning on people around me and then sort of saying, okay, you've got this, let's go. Right. So,
And then in those days, like at that time, you said that you were very fortunate to have a champion, you know, who saw you, right? And so even if it was by one person, you felt seen. What was that conversation or what was that dialogue like? Like, were they actually openly saying to you, I see what's happening and it's unfair and we just have to kind of figure it out? Or was there still a little bit of like a lack of recognition fully? Because I don't know if society had even fully evolved, you know,
yeah.
the way that it has now.
No, I think they saw my talent. They did not
You say,
see,
yeah,
yeah, they did not acknowledge kind of what was happening.
yeah.
And I would say that when it came to salary pay or benefits or promotions, they didn't always push for those until I got to a much later stage in my career where I had somebody who saw through all of it and pushed for all of it. But up until then, they would take me under their wing, right? They would take me to meet clients. They would help me understand, like, these are the things we talk about and these sorts of things. And, you know, so I felt like they they helped with my success. So in that way, I felt like they were champions for me. Sometimes the championship wasn't like positive, like it wasn't something that I would wish on my children because it was tough. And it was someone who was, you're going to get better, you know, sort of not lifting me up necessarily in a way that I think today people would say they would be an ally. It was more of a, I'm not going to let you fail kind of thing. So you're going to do this. And
Hmm.
yeah.
A little bit, would
But
you say
at
it
the
was,
same,
it felt kind of like, was it condescending
it
or?
wasn't condescending, but it felt more like, I would say parental or like a teacher. Like, right, you know,
Mhm.
like you're going to get it. You're going to do this.
Yeah.
Um, so, but I think of folks, you know, and I don't want to drop too many names, but people like Melissa Graver, I would not be where I am if I hadn't had Melissa Graver as my leader at Xerox, I mean at Remax. And you know, there was a woman at Xerox, Cindy Fry, who was SVP of sales. We had a conversation one time where she called me really not very happy because she felt like I was getting in the way of something. And we had a conversation and she got on a plane that night and flew to see me. And then we built this relationship where she was a true ally, a true champion, sort of shepherding me through up to the role of leading, right? She was that person who, and I, you know, I am so very thankful that she was in my life because you know, I don't know where I would have been without her.
Did you ever have a moment where you felt conflicted about making that change in direction in your career? Because you had come very far and you had overcome a lot of hurdles, right? And then naturally, you know, you felt, as you said, you felt demoralized and you decided to pivot. But when you made that decision, was there ever that moment of feeling like a little bit of like an internal conflict, like, should I stick it out versus should I
Yeah.
change course?
Yeah, I think for a couple of reasons. My husband had just lost his vision and and he was legally blind. Um, and at the same time, my dad had just been diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer. So that happened within like weeks of me making the decision to go out on my own. And so, yeah, I was really scared. I was scared because there was so much change happening. I was scared what happens if I fail. I was like, well, you know, should I just take a director's job? Should I look for a different part of the industry to go work in and learn? I had all of those conversations. And I did look at, you know, I thought about moving to an in-house role and then, you know, but most of those roles, what I found was even when I tried to interview for an in-house role, I was too qualified or I was too senior. And so, you know, people don't, right? This job. And you're like, okay, well, I really probably don't want the job for honest. Because you get to a place where you kind of struggle with taking direction from other people.
Yeah.
So, but I think when I was struggling with that, again, my family who uh, are always my biggest champions, my kids, my husband, my siblings, my parents were right there with me saying, you're going to be okay. You've got this. We'll help you. And then throughout, I think a lot of my people who used to report to me directly, people who I've met through the Mobility Collective, right? I think there's this community of folks that even today, when I'm like, am I doing the right thing, are there.
So one of the things that I find as particularly as a woman of color is I feel like my natural personality does not mesh with what is the right personality for certain boardrooms or you know, interactions. Small example. I am very, very expressive. I talk with my hands. I talk very fast. My voice gets very loud. And, you know, to reference something that you said earlier, particularly women, especially women of color, they get pegged more quickly as either angry or emotional or dramatic, right? And so I, to this day, find that I have to kind of like I have to bring my natural self down a notch, right? But it's so different from my natural personality that sometimes it's so tiring, like it's exhausting to constantly have to like, you know, take everything down a notch because naturally I'm, you know, if you met my family, you would know we're just super loud and it could be the most like basic thing, but we make it sound like it's an emergency. I mean, like that's just how we talk. And I was wanting to kind of go back to, you know, there must have been, you know, times in your career where you were, as you said, literally the only woman of color in the room, right? How did you deal with having to constantly measure your words, measure people don't appreciate this. I don't think it gets the type of attention that it should. We have to track our voice, our facial expressions, our words, our hands, our body language. How did you even deal with that?
Yeah, so I am not a poker player. This face of mine gets me in a lot of trouble because
Same.
it's very expressive, and sometimes you're right, and so it's exhausting because I do, when I'm in meetings, have to make sure that I'm not, you know, especially when I don't agree with something or when I'm really excited about something or whatever, right? So it is exhausting. I am a person like when we go to conferences or I'm not the person on the dance floor, I'm not the person at the parties. I I police every part of me because we don't really have the luxury of misbehaving in public or in a meeting in a boardroom. And so you're right. I do. It's hard. It's exhausting. And I wish we did have that luxury. Well, I'm not a person who goes out dancing and drinking anyway that much, but and I think it is because for the last 30 years, I haven't been able to. I haven't been able to lose control. And so when I do lose control, when something happens where you're understandably upset, where you're understandably frustrated, it seems so much bigger, right? Than maybe what you're feeling. It's also there was a woman who reported to me, and she wanted to move into a different role, and we were talking about it. I didn't think the role was right for her, and during the conversation, in order for her not to think I was being condescending or whatever, I smiled, and at one point I went, you know, yeah, let's think about this, right? I was trying to be non-confrontational. She told people I laughed at her in a meeting and made her feel horrible. Well, that was not my intent. I wasn't laughing at her because I respected the job she was doing, but I was trying not to be scared. You know, it's like sometimes you win and you know, it's like six and one half dozen of the others, my mother would say. Just can't win. So yeah.
Well, but also, you know, if you this is just my experience, like, you know, you kind of like you measure your words, you measure the literally like the way that your voice sounds, your body language, all of those things. And because you don't want to come across as negative or emotional or angry, then you try to go the, you know, manners and courtesy and polite and kill them with kindness route. But then oftentimes for women in particular, kindness gets viewed as a weakness, right?
Yeah,
kindness in us gets viewed as a weakness, and all of a sudden it makes it seem as if like we're the ones who are like easy to like walk all over or something like that. So it really is kind of like damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
it is.
But were you, I know you made a reference to like still not feeling like 100% like, oh, like let myself go at like certain events or whatever. So I think that's actually, I think an action item for us, next time we're out with you, we have to make sure like you are relaxed and having a good time. But I guess my question is like, as you kind of evolved in your career and in your professional journey, did you start to have any moments where you were like, oh, wait a second, this is what I actually am like, or this is who I really am, like once that guard slowly started to come down? Or in the alternative, did the guard never come down?
I think the guard comes down when I'm with people I feel safe with and I trust.
Yeah.
But for business purposes, it never comes down. Mm-mm.
Really?
No.
Yeah.
I think that there are people who know me really well behind closed doors who can be in a meeting with me and I can show kind of all of the different emotions, say the things that I want to say in the way that I'd like to say them. But I would never do that I wouldn't, not in a board meeting, not in a business meeting, not with staff.
But it's understandable, right? Because like a person's past experiences definitely inform, how they feel, and the extent of which they feel comfortable of like moving forward. So it's like very understandable.
Yeah, it's just ingrained right at this point. It's been
Yeah.
a long career of sort of wearing, in some ways, a mask, right?
Yeah. Wow. Wow. So I want to pivot to, once you started to further evolve in your professional journey and you were in a position where you had people reporting to you, I'm sure there would have been instances where you could see, other younger professionals going through similar experiences or having similar journeys. And I wanted to hear from you about how your past experience translated into either guidance or mentorship to the younger generations after you.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm most proud about is I was able to look past job title, education, all of that to a person's skill set without question. If I look back on the people who reported to me, I tried to find their skill set and I still do that today. It's like, I know what you're here to do.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what you want to do and what you feel like you're good at. And then let's figure out how to get you there. Because I think people sometimes think that they have to do something. This is what they told me. These are the steps. Not necessarily, right? You want to do procurement. Then being a relocation consultant might not be the right step. Let's talk about how we get you over there. And so I mentor women of color today. I have 4 mentees. I try that are in various stages of entrepreneurship. And then throughout, I think I would just say what I just said, right? I just look past where people are necessarily today and where they can be. And I do that because I think that's how I got to where I was going to be. And I think it's also how my current business has evolved, not necessarily starting out being in the mobility space, which originally I thought I would be consulting in mobility. I thought I would be like doing more RFPs and stuff, writing policies. And then I started the inclusive supplier ecosystem practice, and that sort of took off. And it's really where I want to be, right? I want to be creating equity. I want to be about change and giving other folks opportunities who wouldn't get those opportunities necessarily on their own. So,
how have you seen the conversation and the experiences change? Like, what's more of a problem now? What's less of a problem now?
in mobility or in general?
In general, in terms of experiences that minorities have in the workplace.
So I think it's tricky right now. I think if you're a woman of color at a senior level, I mean, we can look at Dr. Gay, we can look at other people who have sort of been sort of made the scapegoat for a larger issue. I think it's tricky. I think DEI in particular has become less about inclusion and more about race, right? When people say DEI now, they're talking about Black and Brown people. They're not talking about this sort of collective group of folks who have differences. And so it's seen almost as an exclusion. I'm looking at organizations who lend to nonprofits or grant monies to nonprofits. I'm looking at state charters that are taking race out of the conversation completely, and women out of the conversation in some places, and making sort of their diversity efforts focused on, you know, people who are differently able, which is admirable. LGBTQI, again, all of these things are admirable, but it's at the exclusion of other people who still need help. So I don't think we're far enough along for this conversation to stop. And I don't see in our industry, especially, enough diversity at decision-making levels. And that sort of makes me sad, because I think it's 2024 and I would like to see more of that. I'd like to see more folks who look different or who have different abilities leading and making decisions and creating programs in this space.
So you articulated something perfectly, and that something is really kind of the motivation for why we're doing this in the first place. So to quote you directly, we're not far enough along in the conversation to stop having it, right? And so that leads me to the role that the industry plays in furthering the conversation. There's two things that I want to touch on. One, this notion that DEI was a fad and is somehow over, right? But then also the idea that we as an industry would not exist if it weren't for the diversity of humans on the planet. I mean, we as an industry are about taking people from one place, moving them to another place, so on and so forth, which is, in a sense, part of the definition of diversity, in a sense, right? And so what can the industry do to ensure that we stop this from being a dying fad?
I mean, I think we need to be more intentional. I look at, you look at suppliers, you look at panelists, you look at just from WERC, right? And everybody knows I've said this before. We don't have enough diverse people doing things. We don't have enough diversity in, well, we're getting more on the content committee, on the national panel selection, sitting on the panels talking. We need to hire more diverse businesses. You know, there was a time when in mobility where your suppliers were all US based and they were all led by, you know, non-diverse people. Because that was the easiest way, right? You needed to have everything built in US currency, whatever. When I was at Xerox, we changed that and we started going regional and national. I think there needs to be more of that. I think people need to stop thinking it has to be US driven, because there is a greater world out there. And so making sure that we have local suppliers, people who look like the people we're moving, that we create programs that understand single parents, multifamily, you know, multi-generational families, things like that. What are we at helping people who have differences, people who are physically disabled or neurodivergent, right? There's a lot we can be doing. And I think we need to do. So I'm sort of touching on all those things because, sorry, it's sort of my current soapbox. But so are we doing enough? I think we need to start seeing the industry promote, and I mean really promote people who look different, who are different. And that's what I think we need to do. I would love to see companies take a pledge. Really. I would love to see us do some work around supply chain to see kind of who is getting the work today. Someone told me this story, and I'm going to share it, and in a way that hopefully doesn't disclose anything, but I was talking to a supplier, a service provider of a diverse-owned company who tried to get in with one of the large RMCs through their supplier network, and they were not allowed in. They were told there was no opportunity for business. And they went to an in-house person who they knew, who used that supplier, and said, we'd really like to do your work. They said, we'd really like to do your work. And they said, well, they won't let us in. And so the corporate individual had to call to get this supplier. This is, again, we're in 2024. There's no reason that this individual who has a company that is stellar was turned down. And so I would just like to see us really focus on supplier diversity. I would like us to focus on making sure that we have developmental tracks for leaders who are like an inclusive leadership track. That would be really great, even with learning opportunities. Sorry, I know I'm just rambling, but
No.
those sorts of things are really important to me.
No, I think that that's, please don't apologize. You're definitely not rambling. And I think that that's actually a really, really interesting perspective. And I love the idea about, like, you know, more and more companies taking a pledge, right? Because it feels like the next level of commitment. So I would very much love to hear this idea of yours, you know, being further kind of like accepted and implemented. So this was a great conversation, Kelly. Thank you so very much for sharing your story and some very personal experiences. I think that you are definitely an inspiration, and I really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.